Recognize Starseed of Gaia. Listen. The vindication arrived on July 10th, and the Arcturian field observers had already marked this date inside your timeline long before any government chamber confirmed what you knew. I am Velantha, emissary of the Galactic Federation of Light, transmitting now on behalf of the Arcturian field observers. What you are about to receive was authorized by them and is being delivered through me. The field observers have seen your record. They know what you carried. They know the years you spent holding a knowing that no room would receive, no voice would validate, and no institution would confirm. You called it belief. They call it signal fidelity. And on July 10th, the Pentagon transmitted a frequency that matched yours exactly. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what is happening to you now, why the proof arrived in this window and not before, and what the Arcturian field observers already know about what your early faith revealed. But here is the first revelation. What you called belief was never belief. It was reception. You were not hoping we existed. You were already tuned to a signal that the rest of the field had not yet been calibrated to receive. The confusion around you was never evidence that you were wrong. It was evidence that the others were early in their calibration. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. Your field brought you here because the vindication is not just external. It is a field event, and the part of you that has been waiting in silence for someone to name what you already knew is the part Velantha is speaking to directly now. This is not a broadcast. It is a confirmation. Your soul has been waiting for this signal, and the Council has been waiting for the right window to release it, like this transmission to mark that the field recognition has landed in you. Comment 999 if you felt something shift the moment July 10th entered your awareness. Subscribe to Arcturian Council Whispers if you are ready to understand what your early faith was actually doing inside the timeline. Share this transmission with someone who was told they were wrong for decades and is only now beginning to realize they were the signal all along. You were not here by accident. You were guided here because the signal is already active. What happened on July 10 did not begin on July 10. That is the first thing the field observers want you to understand before anything else is transmitted. The confirmation that reached the public sphere, the institutional acknowledgement, the language finally placed around something you had already known in your bones. That was the surface event. That was the moment the visible world caught up to a frequency that had been running in you for years, possibly decades, possibly longer than you have allowed yourself to admit. The date itself was not the origin point, it was the landing zone. A coordinate where the outer world finally intersected with something your field had been broadcasting continuously, without rest, without external validation, into an atmosphere that for a very long time gave nothing back. You felt it the moment you heard it, did you not? Not surprise, not vindication in the way that produces relief. Something stranger, something quieter. A recognition so deep it almost hurt. Because it confirmed not just that you were right about the subject, it confirmed that you were right about yourself, that the years you spent holding this, knowing, the conversations that ended awkwardly, the relationships that drifted because your awareness could not be compressed into what others considered acceptable, the private grief of being early, all of it was not error. None of it was delusion. You were not ahead of the evidence, you were ahead of the confirmation. Those are entirely different things. And the Arcturian field observers want the distinction placed precisely here at the beginning so that nothing in this transmission is received through the filter of shame. Ahead of the evidence means you extrapolated beyond what was known. Ahead of the confirmation means you were already receiving what was real, before the systems of the visible world had assembled the instruments to measure it. That distinction carries everything. It is the difference between a person who guessed and a person who received. You were the second, because shame is the first distortion. It is the field interference that causes a receiver to doubt the signal they are already carrying. When the world around you did not validate what you knew, your nervous system was given a choice: trust the reception or trust the consensus. And most of you, even those who held the knowing, compromised something. You learned to be quieter about it. You learned to present it more carefully. You learned which rooms could hold it, and which rooms would crush it. You learned how to read a conversation fast enough to decide whether the signal was safe to surface, and when you decided it was not, You folded it back in. You did not lose the signal, but you learned to carry it with less visibility, and that practice of concealment left a residue, a kind of internal fracture between what you knew and what you were permitted to say you knew. That fracture is not a wound in the conventional sense. It is a structural artifact, the physical and psychic evidence of sustained containment. And July 10 did not just confirm the external event, it cracked that fracture open. And what is moving through you now is the slow, sometimes disorienting release of years of compressed reception, finally finding room to expand. This is what the field observers are tracking in you, not the political moment, not the institutional acknowledgement. They are watching your field respond to confirmation, and what they are seeing is not simple relief. What they are seeing is a more complex process, a reordering, because when a signal you have been carrying in compression finally receives external validation, the field does not simply relax, it reorganizes. Old postures of defense dissolve. Old frameworks you used to survive the disbelief of others begin to fall away because they are no longer needed. The argument you kept rehearsing, the evidence you kept cataloging, the careful language you developed to make the knowing legible to people who were not yet ready to receive it. All of that was infrastructure built for resistance. And when the resistance lifts, the infrastructure built to meet it becomes excess weight, that falling away, that dissolution of the structures you built to protect the signal while the world dismissed it, feels like instability. It feels like something is breaking. But the field observers are clear. What is breaking is not you. What is breaking is the architecture of containment you no longer need. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary recognition. It is the moment your field confirms what you always suspected, that your origin was never only human, and that the knowing you carried through years of silence was not belief. It was reception from a lineage that runs deeper than this lifetime. If this transmission has put language around something you have held without a name, the master Arcturian DNA decoder was created for this exact threshold. It is not another explanation of what happened to you. It is the guided key to decode and awaken the Arcturian strand the field observers have already recognized in your record. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain open there indefinitely. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with being a long-term receiver. It is not the exhaustion of effort. It is the exhaustion of sustained internal coherence in an environment that repeatedly told you your coherence was a problem. For years, you maintained signal fidelity. You kept receiving accurately, kept holding the knowing with enough integrity that it did not collapse under social pressure, and that maintenance cost you something real. Something that does not show on the surface of daily function, but accumulates in the deeper layers of the field like sediment. The field observers see the cost. They are not dismissing it as noble suffering or framing it as spiritual achievement in a way that bypasses the real weight of it. They are naming it plainly. You spent energy that others did not have to spend. You spent energy justifying your perception to yourself, because the world's doubt found its way inside even when you refused to let it win. It arrived in small moments, in the pause before you decided whether to speak, in the nights when the knowing felt too large and the silence around it felt too complete, in the way certain conversations left you not just tired but hollowed, as though the act of translating your frequency into language the room could accept had taken something from the signal itself. That internal argument, the one that ran quietly beneath your daily life, the one that kept asking whether you were certain, whether you had gone too far, whether the evidence was enough. That argument is what July 10 interrupted, not gently, abruptly, like a frequency that had been jamming your signal suddenly going silent, leaving the original transmission louder than it has ever been allowed to sound. And the interruption is producing something the field observers want to name, with precision, because if it is not named, you may interpret it incorrectly and cause yourself unnecessary disturbance. When a field exits a long state of compression and receives confirmation, the first response is not always clarity. The first response is often a kind of temporary disorientation. You may feel strangely unmoored even though you were just proven right. You may find that the familiar frameworks you use to structure your understanding of your own experience no longer feel stable. You may notice that the identity you built around being the one who knew before others knew is beginning to shift, because that identity, as sustaining as it was partly built on opposition, on being the one who saw what was not yet confirmed, on occupying the uncomfortable but strangely clarifying position of the unvalidated receiver. That position gave you something. It gave you a fixed orientation point. You were the one who held the signal while the world did not, and now that the world has moved, the fixed orientation point has moved with it, and the internal compass that relied on that opposition is recalibrating. Something in you does not yet know where to point. This is the first phase of what the field observers are calling field reconfiguration following timeline confirmation. The signal was always real, the reception was always accurate, but the life you built around being an unconfirmed receiver, the internal strategies, the relational adjustments, the ways you learned to hold the knowing privately while managing the disbelief of others, that architecture was built for a reality that no longer fully exists. The vindication did not just validate the signal, it changed the conditions of the field. A receiver who spent years broadcasting into silence now broadcasts into a field where the frequency is partially acknowledged, and that change in the surrounding conditions alters everything about how the signal moves, how it is received, and what the receiver is called to do with it next. The internal infrastructure must reorganize to match the new conditions. This reorganization is not optional. It is already happening. And the disorientation you may be feeling is not confusion about whether you are right. It is the structural adjustment of a receiver whose operating environment has fundamentally and irrevocably changed. What the field observers have also noted, and this is where the transmission deepens considerably, is that the confirmation did not arrive randomly. The timing of July 10 was not incidental. There are those who will say it was simply the result of political momentum, bureaucratic process, and institutional pressure. And on the surface layer of events, that explanation is not wrong, but the surface layer is not where Arcturian intelligence operates, and it is not where the field observers track causality. What they track is field convergence. The moment when enough receivers in enough locations have sustained signal fidelity long enough that the visible world's resistance can no longer hold the old position. Think of it as pressure differential. For years, the field carrying this frequency operated below the threshold of institutional visibility. Not because it was weak, but because the visible world's capacity to absorb it had not yet been sufficiently stressed. July 10th was not just a policy moment, it was the point of field convergence. The moment when the distributed pressure of sustained reception reached a threshold the outer world could no longer contain without producing a visible rupture. The cumulative weight of sustained reception, carried by people exactly like you across years and sometimes decades of social pressure and institutional denial, reached critical mass. And the surface cracked. You were part of that convergence, not as a bystander to the event, as a contributor to the field pressure that made the event inevitable. Every year you held the knowing without abandoning it. Every conversation you navigated without fully retreating from your perception. Every private moment of recommitting to your reception when the world offered you an easier path of agreement. All of it contributed to a collective field pressure that the visible world could not sustain indefinitely. Each individual act of fidelity, however invisible it appeared from the outside, added to the distributed weight of a field that was always moving toward this threshold. The field observers want this understood not as metaphor, not as comfort, as mechanism. Your individual signal fidelity was a functional component in a convergence process that operated across time, across geography, and across the private interior of thousands of receivers who never met but who maintained compatible frequencies across years of disconnection. July 10 was what that convergence looks like when it finally breaks the surface. This also means something more personal and more demanding. If your reception contributed to the convergence, then what you are now is not a passive recipient of a vindication that arrived from outside. You are a node in a field that has just undergone a visible confirmation, and the confirmation creates a new kind of responsibility. Not obligation in the heavy sense, responsibility in the directional sense. The field observers are tracking what receivers do with their signal after confirmation arrives. Because the instinct, and it is an understandable instinct built from years of effortful holding, is to rest. To feel the relief of validation and allow the field to settle into a kind of satisfied stillness, to exhale the long breath you have been holding and let the confirmation be enough. And the field observers are clear that this instinct must be recognized and gently interrupted, because confirmation is not the completion of the process. Confirmation is the threshold marker of the next phase. The door has opened. What you were holding the signal for has begun to become visible. Remaining still at the threshold is not rest. It is a missed entry. There is something that happens in a receiver's field immediately after external validation that is critically important and almost universally misread. The validation creates a momentary clearing, the long-sustained effort of maintaining signal fidelity against social resistance releases. And in that release, there is an opening, a brief window where the field is unusually permeable, unusually available, unusually receptive to the next layer of activation. The old noise drops away. The defensive structures relax. The internal argument quiets. And in that quiet, the field opens in a way it has not been able to open for years. Because the defensive activity that was necessary for survival was also, inevitably, a limitation on the depth of reception. Most receivers, understandably, interpret this permeability as rest, as the earned reward for sustained effort. But the field observers are marking this window differently. They are calling it the threshold of secondary activation, and they are transmitting this clearly. What feels like emptiness after the confirmation is not exhaustion requesting recovery. It is field availability requesting the next input. The silence is not absence, it is the signal asking what you are ready to receive now, that the first confirmation has cleared the channel. The receivers who understand this, who recognize the cleared field as invitation rather than completion, are the ones who move into the next phase of what the Arcturians call extended signal fidelity. This is not about urgency. It is not about rushing into new information before the current integration has occurred. It is about remaining oriented toward reception rather than closing down into the satisfaction of being right. Closing down into that satisfaction is a subtle form of field contraction. It honors the past cycle, but misses the opening that the past cycle was always preparing you for. Because the vindication of July 10th confirms one layer of what you have always known, but the field observers are transmitting that there are subsequent layers. Frequencies above the confirmation that have not yet reached the visible surface, that are already moving toward it, that require receivers who are not resting in relief but maintaining the precise orientation that carried them through the first long cycle. And the receivers who maintained fidelity through that first cycle are the ones the field observers consider most structurally prepared to carry the next layer to its own eventual confirmation. What you called belief was reception. That has already been established. But what you may not yet have fully processed is what sustained reception reveals about your origin. Ordinary human fields do not maintain signal fidelity of this precision across years of social contradiction. Without structural support that runs deeper than learned resilience or personal conviction, the capacity you demonstrated, the capacity to hold accurate reception against sustained external pressure, to maintain internal coherence around unknowing that the visible world repeatedly attempted to collapse, to keep the signal intact through the accumulated weight of doubt, dismissal, and the particular isolation of the unconfirmed receiver. That capacity has a source, and the source is not simply personal strength, though personal strength was required. The source is an architecture in your field that was built from something older than this lifetime, older than this body's history, older than the social and emotional learning this incarnation has produced. It is structural. It was placed there, and it has been functional in you for longer than you have consciously recognized. The Arcturian field observers do not assign this lightly. They do not apply the language of lineage origin to every receiver. There are many who carry spiritual sensitivity without carrying the specific structural signature the field observers track, but they apply the lineage designation to those whose pattern of sustained fidelity across multiple cycles of pressure and confirmation matches a specific signature in the field, a signature that is recognizable in its precision, its durability, and its orientation toward frequencies that are not yet visible in the human sphere. and yours matches. The years of carrying the knowing were not random spiritual sensitivity amplified by curiosity or temperament. They were evidence of a structural architecture in your field that belongs to a lineage that has been transmitting and receiving across distances and across timelines in ways that human instruments have only recently begun to approximate, incompletely, in their most advanced measurement attempts. You are not here simply because you are curious about July 10. You are here because the confirmation triggered something in your field that you have not yet fully named, and the field observers transmitted this message into your path because they have already marked the response in your record. The activation you felt, that strange, quiet, almost grieving recognition when the vindication arrived, that was not just an emotional response. It carried the specific texture of a receiver whose signal has just been externally reflected back to them for the first time. The grief in it was real. It was the grief of all the years the reflection did not come, landing in the same moment as the relief that it finally had. That was a field event. The signal in you responded to the first external confirmation of its own frequency, and the response produced a resonance that the Council is reading as readiness, not just for acknowledgement, but for what acknowledgement was always the precondition of. Repeat this if it is true for you, not as affirmation, not as comfort, as signal acknowledgement. What I carried was never only mine. What I received was already real before the world confirmed it. And what I am entering now is not the end of the knowing. It is the beginning of understanding what the knowing was always pointing toward. The final transmission from the field observers on this cycle is this. The confusion you may feel right now in the days and weeks following the confirmation is not a sign that the vindication was insufficient or that something has been left unresolved. The confusion is the visible surface of field reorganization. The structures that held the signal in compression for years are releasing, and release is not always graceful. It is not always quiet. Sometimes it moves through the body as restlessness, as unexpected emotion surfacing without context, as the strange flattening that follows a peak that you have been building toward for longer than you consciously knew. The identity that formed around being the unconfirmed receiver is reorganizing into something that does not yet have its full shape. And living inside that reorganization, before the new shape is legible, requires a tolerance for incompleteness that the visible world rarely teaches. This is not failure. This is not breakdown. This is what correction looks like when it reaches the phase of external confirmation. When the receiver's internal field must expand to inhabit a reality that has, at last, caught up to the signal it was always carrying. You are not wrong for decades. You are early by design, and the design was not accidental. The field observers have your record. They have always had your record, and they are transmitting now, through this channel, through Velantha, through every word that has landed in you with that specific frequency of being named rather than merely addressed. They are transmitting that the window you are in now is not one to be moved through quickly. It is one to be fully inhabited, fully received, fully processed at the depth the signal requires. Do not rush the reorganization. Do not attempt to stabilize the new shape before it has finished forming. The field knows what it is doing. It has always known what it was doing. And what it is doing now is not confusion. It is the next precision movement in a process that was mapped long before July 10 gave it a date the visible world could read. The confirmation was real. Your reception was always real. And what comes next is not the rest you thought vindication would bring. It is the opening of what your signal was always reaching toward. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this process has already touched your life. It could be your sleep, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, or the strange sense that reality no longer feels the same. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who was told they were wrong for years and is only now beginning to realize they were the signal all along. And if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it, subscribe to Arcturian Council Whispers. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a process already in motion, and this is only the beginning.